Chapter 1. The Quiet Passenger. When I first saw her standing in Dock Ring 9 under the flickering blue customs lights, clutching a travel case with both hands like it might dissolve if she loosened her grip, I thought the station had assigned me the easiest transport job of my life. She was small by the standards of most frontier species, slim and soft-spoken, with pale silver skin that caught the overhead light in a faint pearled sheen and wide violet eyes that never seemed to settle in one place for long. Her dark hair was braided back too neatly, her coat buttoned all the way to the throat in the sort of careful, old-fashioned style that made her look less like a troublemaker and more like someone who apologized when other people bumped into her. The assignment chip identified her as Lyra Vess, Civilian Research Liaison, passage approved from the Elysian Academies to the outer colony of Aster Reach. My job was simple. Get her and her sealed scientific cargo safely across 3 short jumps in my battered courier vessel, the Wayfarer Finch, collect the credits, and try not to let the engine overheat in front of another paying client. Easy. At least that was what I thought, right up until she looked at me, blinked once, and asked in a voice so soft I nearly missed it, "Captain Rowan, if pirates board us, do you usually surrender quickly or make it entertaining?" That should have warned me. Instead, because I am apparently an idiot with a long and decorated history of underestimating danger when it comes wrapped in a gentle voice, I just laughed and assumed she was nervous in a scholarly sort of way. "Depends who's shooting," I said, taking her travel case and leading her toward the docking tube. "You expecting trouble?" She lowered her eyes at once, and if I had not spent half my life hauling strange passengers through stranger sectors, I might have missed the tiny curve at the corner of her mouth. "Not at all," she said. "I was only curious what kind of man I'd be traveling with." It was an odd answer, but not odd enough to stop me. Out on the frontier, you learn quickly that everyone has some harmless eccentricity if they're traveling alone. Some collect spores. Some talk to dead relatives through relay static. Some ask too many questions about pirate boarding etiquette. I filed Lyra in the same category and spent the next hour prepping the ship while she sat in the co-pilot chair, hands folded in her lap, looking for all the world like a very polite schoolteacher who had taken a wrong turn and ended up on the kind of freighter that smelled faintly of engine grease and recycled coffee. Then we hit the first jump, and the real trouble started. Not external trouble, personal trouble. The kind that slips in under your guard while you're still congratulating yourself for how manageable everything seems. Most passengers either chatter too much during jump prep because they're nervous, or go silent and try to sleep through the engine vibration. Lyra did neither. She watched everything. Every switch. Every NAV correction. Every little curse I muttered when the port stabilizer hiccuped on ignition. She watched with that same apparently shy reserve, but there was an intensity beneath it that grew more noticeable the longer we were alone in the cockpit. When I caught her looking, she would glance down instantly, almost demurely, and ask some innocent question that somehow managed to feel much less innocent by the time it reached my ears. "Do human captains always pilot one-handed?" she asked once, while I guided us through debris scatter and kept one arm braced above my head. Another time, "Is it true your species enjoys risk, or do you just pretend to look calm when everything is almost exploding?" She never said anything openly improper. Not once. Yet there was a current in the way she asked, a kind of amused testing, as if she were gently pressing on every edge of my composure just to see where it gave first. By the end of the first day, I had revised my opinion of her slightly. Still shy, I told myself. Just. Not fragile. Maybe one of those academy types who act quiet until they realize they're smarter than everyone in the room. I've met a few. Usually they want to lecture me about route geometry or tell me my cargo manifests are organized by chaotic intuition. Lyra didn't lecture. She smiled. Softly. Patiently. As though she knew something I didn't and was enjoying the delay before discovery. When we stopped in a refuel lane over Orin's Belt, I offered her the use of the small galley while I ran diagnostics. 10 minutes later, she emerged having somehow turned my emergency ration pack, a tin of preserved fruit, and 2 packets of spice broth into an actual hot meal that smelled better than anything that had ever legally existed on the Wayfarer Finch. "I improvised," she said when I stared. "I hope you don't mind." Mind. I almost proposed marriage on the spot. Instead, I sat across from her at the tiny galley table, eating in reverent silence while she watched me over the rim of her cup with eyes far too amused for someone supposedly timid. That was the first time I realized her shyness wasn't exactly shyness. It was control. Some people dominate a room by speaking loudly, standing broadly, demanding attention. Lyra did the opposite. She made herself seem smaller, quieter, almost delicate, and in doing so pulled everyone else into underestimating her by instinct. Even me. Especially me. The awareness should have made me cautious. Instead, it made me curious, which was worse. By night cycle, the ship lights were low, the engines steady, and we were 2 days from Aster Reach. She stood in the cockpit doorway wrapped in one of my spare thermal blankets, hair unbound now and falling in dark waves around her shoulders, looking less like an academy liaison and more like trouble disguised as moonlight. "Captain Rowan," she said softly, "may I ask you something personal?" I should have said no. Any sensible man would have. Instead, I leaned back in the pilot's chair and made the worst decision available. "Sure." She tilted her head. Do human men always think they are observing the situation, when in fact the situation is observing them? I stared at her. She smiled. And that was the moment I knew, with perfect and somewhat horrifying clarity, that I had made a serious mistake. She wasn't just shy. She was playing with me. Chapter 2. The Woman Behind the Smile. Once you realize someone has been quietly steering the emotional weather around you without ever appearing to move, every earlier conversation reorganizes itself into evidence. That was what happened to me sometime during the second night. While the Wayfarer Finch drifted between lane beacons and Lyra sat cross-legged in the co-pilot chair pretending to study star charts, she clearly already understood. I replayed the trip from the beginning. The pirate question in the docking ring, the way she washed my hands on the controls, the perfectly timed innocent remarks, the soft voice that somehow always landed exactly where my attention was weakest. None of it had been accidental. She had been measuring me from the first minute, and worse, she'd been doing it with a kind of delighted restraint that made me feel like a large, useful animal being slowly coaxed into admitting it had wandered into someone else's experiment. I should have been annoyed. Instead, to my own embarrassment, I found the whole thing strangely exhilarating. "You've been doing this on purpose," I said at last. She did not even bother to look surprised. "Doing what?" "That." I waved a hand vaguely in her direction, which was unhelpful because everything about her at that moment counted as that. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder. Her boots were off. She was tucked into my ship like she had always belonged there, watching me with those impossible violet eyes and the faintest curve of a smile. "The act," I said. "The shy, quiet, harmless passenger act." Lyra set the star map aside with infuriating calm. "I am quiet," she said. "I am also harmless to anyone behaving sensibly." "That sounds like a threat." "It was flirtation," she corrected. "But I understand human men require more warning labels." I choked on my own breath so badly she had the decency to wait until I stopped coughing before laughing. And what a laugh it was, low, warm, openly delighted, nothing like the careful, almost whispers she used in stations or public corridors. It changed her whole face. That, more than anything, told me I was finally meeting the real woman beneath the performance. Not timid, not hesitant, not even especially restrained. She had been restraining me. The distinction mattered. "You enjoy this, don't you?" I said. "Immensely. Making me feel off balance." "Captain," she said, leaning one elbow on the console and lowering her voice to that velvet soft register she knew was dangerous. "You have felt off balance since I asked about pirate boarding. I have merely been kind enough not to say so." I could have ended it there. Pulled rank, kept things formal, retreated behind captain-passenger professionalism. That would have been the smart choice. The issue with smart choices is that they are much easier to recognize from a distance than at close range with an attractive alien woman watching you like you are simultaneously a puzzle, a joke, and a perfectly decent evening's entertainment. So instead of retreating, I asked the one question my pride insisted on asking. "All right, why me?" For the first time since I'd met her, she gave a real answer without teasing around the edges. "Because," she said, "most men tell you what they are within the first quarter hour. The loud ones tell you immediately. The dangerous ones tell you by trying to impress you. The frightened ones tell you by boasting. You didn't do any of that. You were careful with my cargo. You let me board first. You pretended not to notice that I was scanning your escape routes in the docking ring because you decided very quickly, that if I was worried, then I probably had a reason. And when you thought I was simply timid, you were gentle about it without becoming condescending. She tilted her head, studying me again with unnerving directness. That combination is uncommon. There are compliments that flatter the ego and compliments that cut underneath it. Hers did the second, because now I understood she had not singled me out for random amusement. She had chosen to test me. The flirtation, the teasing, the supposed shyness, it had all been a way of learning whether I would stay decent once uncertainty got involved. That realization should have made me feel noble. Instead, it made me feel newly nervous, which she noticed at once. Interesting, Lyra murmured. What is? You only get quiet when you're the one being looked at properly. I stood up then, mostly to prove to myself that I still knew how to move under my own will. You're impossible. No, she said, smiling more openly now. Just honest in a more entertaining format. The next morning, trouble arrived in the form of a customs cruiser with too much authority and too little reason to be in our lane. I recognized the registry before the hail finished resolving. Draxon Compact Internal Security. Not military, technically, but close enough to ruin anyone's day if they decided your paperwork had philosophical defects. I swore softly and pulled our speed down. Lyra, who had been peacefully drinking tea as though our last conversation hadn't rearranged the gravity on my ship, looked toward the forward screen without visible concern. Are they a problem? She asked. Depends how much they enjoy bothering small independent captains. They are Draxon, she said. So yes. That made me turn. You know them? Her expression shifted in a way I had not seen before. The playfulness remained, but something sharper moved underneath it. My family negotiated with their inner courts for a time, she said. They prefer leverage to force. If they are here, they are not checking cargo at random. That was the first piece of information she had given me that sounded like the opening line of a much larger story. Before I could press, the hail came through. A stiff-faced Draxon officer demanded registry, route, passenger disclosure, and inspection compliance under anti-smuggling protocols. Standard pressure. Annoying, but survivable unless, of course, your passenger had neglected to mention she might be the reason such a ship was waiting in a quiet lane at all. I cut the channel and looked at her. Lyra. She folded her hands in her lap. Yes. Would now be the wrong time to ask whether your research liaison posting is fake? She considered that with insulting seriousness. Not fake. Incomplete. Meaning, she said, that I am technically a research liaison. I am also the daughter of a minor illicit diplomatic house, recently promised in a negotiation I found deeply unappealing, and currently in possession of evidence proving the Draxon illegally manipulated 3 colonial border accords for private gain. I stared at her for a full 3 seconds. Then I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was either laugh or walk directly into vacuum. So, I said, you're not just a shy passenger. She smiled with all the elegance of a woman who had waited very patiently for me to catch up. Captain Rowan, she said, I believe by now we have established that quite thoroughly. Chapter 3, The Chase Through the Dark. There are moments in a person's life when several truths arrive together so quickly that the mind, out of kindness, refuses to separate them until later. In my case, those truths were these. First, that Lyra Vess was not remotely who her original passage papers suggested. Second, that the Draxon Customs cruiser was absolutely not here by coincidence. And third, that despite all of this, despite common sense and professional survival instinct, and the entire healthy human tradition of not getting dragged into aristocratic alien scandals, I was already committed. Not because I'd signed anything. Not because I was noble. Because somewhere between Karen cargo routes, shared meals, impossible teasing, and the particular look she got when she stopped pretending to be small, the idea of handing her over had become morally indistinguishable from self-betrayal. Tell me everything, I said. She glanced toward the active hail light. While they are waiting? Yes. Quickly. That won me a flash of admiration I was unreasonably proud of. So she told me fast, precise, and without a drop of self-pity. Her mother's house had arranged a political match with a Draxon trade heir to stabilize a contested corridor and secure access to several research archives. Lyra had been expected to smile, sign, and spend the rest of her life being decorative proof that 2 unpleasant powers could cooperate. Unfortunately for everyone involved except me, she had inherited neither docility nor strategic blindness. While reviewing inter-house communications, she discovered evidence that the Draxen had engineered the very crisis her marriage was meant to soothe, sacrificing colonial populations and manipulating cargo seizures to create artificial dependency. Rather than confront her family directly and be quietly contained, she had copied the records, fabricated the liaison posting, and boarded the first discreet ship-out system she thought wouldn't ask too many questions. "And you picked mine?" I said. "You had kind eyes and a terrible docking pattern," she replied. It felt trustworthy. That is the worst compliment I've ever received. It is still a compliment. The cruiser hailed again, less patiently this time. I muted it and ran fast calculations. They outgunned me badly, outran me slightly. In a clean lane with legal witnesses, I would have had no reasonable basis to refuse inspection. We did not, unfortunately, occupy a clean lane anymore. We occupied a thin stretch of dark between beacon clusters where reason had already started packing its bags. "If I surrender for inspection," I said, "what happens to you?" Lyra's answer was immediate. "Publicly, diplomatic return. Privately, I vanish into family correction or Draxen custody. The evidence disappears. My future becomes a very elegant cage." That settled it. I powered the hail down entirely and punched the Finch into a hard lateral burn that made the whole ship shriek like outraged metal theology. The Draxen cruiser reacted instantly, vectoring to cut us off rather than blast us outright, confirmation, if any was needed, that they wanted her intact. That worked in our favor. Slightly. Not enough to matter unless I got creative, which is another way of saying irresponsible with good timing. "Strap in," I barked. Lyra already had. The route ahead wasn't a route so much as a collection of bad ideas orbiting a dead mining field. Broken tugs, decommissioned scoop rigs, half-salvaged station skeletons, and enough metallic debris to make sensor lock unreliable if you knew how to move between the gaps. I did. Barely. The Draxen captain, by contrast, had probably spent most of his career boarding compliant freighters and citing legal precedent at people too poor to argue. He followed, because pride and authority both hate looking outmaneuvered by patched civilian ships. That was his mistake. The chase burned hot and ugly through the debris maze. I killed our main lights, cut heat where I could, rolled us through the spine of an old or rig so close the hull scraped paint off both sides in long whining screams. Lyra, instead of panicking or praying or asking whether I'd lost my mind, leaned over the tactical sideboard and started reading drift vectors faster than my NAV assistant ever had. "Left in 3 seconds, she said once, voice steady as silk. Then down. Their lock is widening on the upper arc. Another time. If you clip that antenna array, the scatter will blind us too." I did not clip it, mostly because she sounded offended at the possibility. There is something uniquely motivating about not wanting to disappoint a woman who has decided you might be useful. We nearly lost them at the coolant graveyard, a floating cluster of ancient thermal tanks and reflective plating that turned targeting systems into superstition. Nearly. The Draxen clipped us with a warning shot across the stern quarter, hard enough to throw sparks through the engine conduit and dump half my stabilization controls into red. I swore. Lyra was already moving. "Port vent assembly," she snapped. "If the fire reaches the secondary feed, we become an anecdote." She tore open the maintenance hatch before I could answer and vanished shoulder-deep into the panelwork with more speed than elegance. I caught one glimpse of her, their dark hair coming loose, sleeves rolled, slim hands moving through smoke and wiring with total unhesitating competence, and had the profoundly inconvenient thought that "wild seductress" might in fact be the wrong phrase. She was worse than that. She was capable. That is far more dangerous. She saved the engine in under a minute, emerged with soot on one cheek and a grin so bright with adrenaline that I nearly forgot the cruiser trying to own our future. "You may continue being dramatic now," she said. "We are not exploding yet." Somewhere in the middle of all that, I realized I was in trouble far beyond the tactical kind. Not just because I had defied the Draxen, aided a politically sensitive fugitive, and committed enough legal nonsense to make my future tax filings interesting, but because fear and attraction had merged into one sharp, bright thing, and every time Lyra looked at me like I was worth choosing in a crisis, My better judgment became less structurally important. We got clear only because the old mining field opened into a radiation-churned dust pocket no sane cruiser captain would enter at pursuit speed. I entered at pursuit speed. The Finch rattled like it intended to file complaints with every deity in range, but the Draxon ship peeled off rather than risk its polished systems in the interference cloud. For 12 long seconds we ran blind except for instrument ghosts and Lyra's hand braced on the back of my chair. Then the noise dropped, the stars steadied, and we were out the far side with half our warning boards lit and nobody dead. Nobody spoke for a little while. Then Lyra laughed. Not the soft, clever laugh from the galley table. Not the restrained amusement of a woman watching me trip over her traps. This was full-throated, breathless, wild with survival and delight. I turned in my chair to stare at her, and there she was, hair falling loose, pulse bright at her throat, soot on her skin, eyes alive with so much fierce joy that the last scraps of her old shy passenger illusion finally burned away forever. She saw my expression and, instead of composing herself, only laughed harder. "What?" she asked. "I thought you were quiet." "I am quiet in boring situations. That answer should be illegal in at least 4 systems." I stood, because sitting any longer felt like surrendering territory I still vaguely believed was mine. She rose too, slower now, the laughter fading into something more charged. We were close in the cockpit suddenly, closer than accident required. The ship humming around us in the strange calm after danger, when every living nerve still thinks the world might tilt again if spoken to incorrectly. "You are absolutely not what I expected," I said. "That was the idea. And this whole time you've been enjoying yourself." Her smile turned almost unbearably knowing. "Captain Rowan, I started enjoying myself the moment you realized I wasn't timid and still didn't back away." There it was. Honest at last. I could have answered lightly, could have flirted sideways and preserved some fragment of balance. Instead, I said the truest thing available. "That was my mistake." "No," she said softly. "That was your courage." Then she reached up, brushed one soot-dark thumb across my jaw where I'd apparently caught grease and blood in equal measure, and asked in a voice that could have unraveled steel if properly aimed, "Tell me honestly, are you regretting any of this?" The galaxy, the law, and every surviving rational instinct all screamed that I should say yes. I didn't. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Chose Him Back. We made Aster reach 2 days late, half-burned, flying on improvised engine discipline, and carrying enough politically explosive evidence to make 3 governments nervous and at least 1 marriage alliance terminally awkward. The station itself was a bright orbital spindle above a pale green colony world, the sort of place built to look orderly enough that frontier settlers could believe civilization had followed them properly into the dark. We arrived without dignity. Port Control nearly denied us entry on site until Lyra transmitted the evidence packet through emergency diplomatic and colonial anti-corruption channels simultaneously, at which point every secure office on the station began shouting at every other secure office, and our docking priority changed from suspicious civilian nuisance to please land immediately before this becomes even more complicated. Complicated, it turned out, was now the permanent climate around us. Once the packet opened, events moved with all the ugly speed of powerful people realizing they had been outmaneuvered by someone they had planned to marry off and silence. The Draxon denied everything, then selectively denied, then shifted into the sort of legalistic outrage usually reserved for states caught naked in someone else's transmission logs. Lyra's house sent 3 different messages in one day, one demanding her immediate protected return, one insisting she had been manipulated by external actors, and one private, late, and painfully human in its coldness from her mother asking why she could not simply have obeyed long enough for everyone else to remain comfortable. Lyra read that last one without expression and then deleted it so thoroughly, I suspect even station forensics could not have recovered the ghost. As for me, I expected to be thanked briefly and then pushed out of the center once proper authorities took over. That was usually how these things went. The freelance captain who smuggles the witness through danger gets his bruises, his statement, maybe a sealed payment if the bureaucracy feels generous, and then everyone with titles takes the moral credit while advising him to disappear before prosecution catches up. I was prepared for that. I even told myself it would be cleaner that way. Lyra would enter protected channels. I'd repair the Finch, take a very dull freight route for a few months, and pretend the whole thing hadn't permanently altered my taste in women in trouble. Then she refused protective custody. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Lyra simply listened to the station governor's polished assurance about secure diplomatic quarters, vetted attendance, and temporary separation from non-essential civilian associates, and said, no. The governor, who had not often been told no by elegant women with evidence enough to collapse regional accords, blinked. Lyra folded her hands and repeated herself more sweetly. I will testify. I will release the archive trail. I will answer every lawful inquiry. But I am not disappearing into another beautiful room where other people decide when I may leave. She turned then, in front of the whole chamber, and looked directly at me. My current captain has proven more reliable than most governments. I intend to remain with him. If you have never been publicly selected by a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, I do not recommend the experience if you value stable blood pressure. The room went dead silent. Then 3 different officials started talking at once. Lyra ignored all of them. That was the beginning of the second phase, the one no one warns you about in rescue stories. Once the immediate danger passes, you discover whether what formed in crisis can survive administrative daylight. Lyra could have moved into safety and let me become a useful footnote in her escape narrative. I could have accepted the role and retreated before attachment hardened into something life-changing. Instead, through a combination of mutual stubbornness, bad timing, and the simple fact that neither of us seemed capable of pretending indifference anymore, we chose the harder road. She stayed on the Wayfarer Finch while legal proceedings dragged across weeks. I repaired the ship and discovered it now contained entirely too many books, too much expensive tea, and one alien aristocrat who took over my galley as though she had been morally offended by its previous standards. We argued over routes, slept too little, watched too closely, and learned each other in the long, unglamorous hours between crisis spikes. That was where the truth of her finally settled. She was seductive, yes, but not in the crude dramatic way the phrase suggests. Not some constant blaze of hunger or performance. Her danger was finer than that. Lyra seduced through attention, through choosing exactly when to go quiet, and when to become impossibly direct, through seeing me much too clearly and not treating that clarity as a weapon unless I deserved it, through moving around the ship like she had always known how to belong anywhere, and then looking at me, sometimes, with such wickedly amused warmth that I'd forget my own name halfway through a sentence. The wild part, I learned, had nothing to do with recklessness and everything to do with freedom. She had spent years being arranged, expected, negotiated over. Once free, she intended to be alive on purpose, and that aliveness was far more powerful than anything I'd first assumed behind her shy smiles. One night, near the end of the hearings, we took the Finch out beyond station traffic to run a stress test on the repaired port systems. That was the excuse, anyway. The real reason was that the station had become too full of watching eyes, legal whispers, and people who suddenly believed they had a say in what Lyra should do next. Out in the dark above Astor Reach, with the colony world turning green and white below us and the cockpit lights low, the universe felt briefly reduced to engine hum and breath and unresolved truths. Lyra sat sideways in the co-pilot chair, one leg folded beneath her, reading over the final testimony extracts. I flew by instinct more than need. Eventually she set the slate aside and said, "You still think I deceived you?" It wasn't really a question. I think, I said carefully, that I was an idiot. That part is true. I looked over. She was smiling, but gently, not mocking. What I mean, I said, is that I thought you were one thing because it was easier for me than considering the real version. The real version being? A woman who notices everything, who enjoys making arrogant men work for balance, who can repair a thermal vent under pursuit fire, who would rather terrify a station governor than be protected by him, who probably started flirting with me before I even knew I was part of the game. Lyra leaned closer by degrees, so smooth I only noticed the distance disappearing after it was already gone. Not a game, she said softly. An investigation. Into what? Her gaze dropped once, briefly, to my mouth, and then rose again with enough deliberate honesty to make the whole ship feel smaller. Into whether you were worth choosing back. That sentence finished me. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember the look in her eyes, bright, intent, entirely unafraid. I remember one hand braced on the edge of her chair, the other brushing the line of her jaw, as if giving myself a final chance to stop. She did not stop me. On the contrary, she tilted into the touch with that same impossible mix of control and invitation that had undone me from the first day. The kiss, when it came, was not shy. Neither was it wild in the careless sense. It was precise, certain, almost fierce with long-delayed choice. Like everything else about her, it felt as though she had known exactly what she wanted and had simply waited for the universe to stop being noisy enough for it to happen properly. When we finally pulled apart, I rested my forehead against hers and let out a laugh that sounded a little wrecked around the edges. "Your trouble?" "Yes," she said. "But by now that can't be shocking." "No, not shocking. Just true." The legal war ended uglily but decisively after that. The Draxon lost two major corridor claims. Lyra's house survived, though in a much reduced and embarrassed form, and sent one final heavily edited message implying she might still return once she had finished making her point. She forwarded it to me with the note, "I believe they still think I am in a phase." I replied, "You are. It's called freedom." She laughed for a full minute. Then she kissed me again in the machine bay while the Finch's engines were still warm. So no, she was never just a shy alien. That was only the first veil, worn because the world had taught her that underestimation was often safer than direct power. Underneath it lived a woman bold enough to destroy her own arranged future, clever enough to outplay a diplomatic trap, and alive enough to choose exactly who she wanted beside her once the dust settled. The stunned part, in the end, wasn't that she turned out to be a wild seductress. It was that after all the danger, all the lies, all the running and choosing and almost losing, she chose me back with her eyes open. And I've been off balance ever since.